Well, when they came in, it was over 200, about 240,000, but they went up to over 400,000 because these were reserves.
Yeah.
So the combination was over
It was a
400,000.
serious army.
Yes, it was a very good army, very well trained, had lots of equipment. And when the Russians went in, they only actually had initially on the ground in Ukraine, in that part of Ukraine, only about 90,000 troops.
But what was Putin thinking at the time? I mean, he saw this serious buildup of an army, but then he comes in with an army of 100,000 soldiers. In a strange way, there was not first an air fight or something like that. He just went in and...
Listen, you're asking critical questions, and I'm sure we'll know the absolute facts, but let's back up and talk about what...
Did you understand?
Oh, yes, yeah, I do now. I did not at the time.
Okay.
Neither did the Russians. Okay, and we have to understand this. When he first went in, I think he thought this was his opportunity to signal to us how serious he was, as though we were going to suddenly change our approach and take him seriously. He completely misjudged this.
Yeah.
Putin is someone that has always been of, major Russian figures, probably the single most Western-oriented or pro-Western leader of the bunch. Very much so.
Yeah, he lived in Germany for...
Yes, yeah, he did. You'd have to go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century to find Russian czars who had the kind of positive view of the West that he does, or did. And I think this was part of the problem. He assumed that we would react. Well, he didn't understand that our view of the Russians was completely skewed in favor of the Russians are weak, the Russians are corrupt, the Russians are stupid, the Russians are incapable. I mean, just go down the list. This is really what people in Washington thought. And I remember having conversations with some of them in these think tanks. And I tried to tell this one gentleman who's very prominent, you see him from time to time on YouTube and television. And I said, don't you understand? The Russian military is not the same as Western militaries. You may look at them and say, well, they don't seem to be quite as polished. They don't seem to be as well equipped or well fitted in their uniforms and so forth. Those things are superficial. The Russian army has always had this sort of loose-looking soldier. And it's always had large numbers of non-Russians with it. Units of Uzbeks and units of Chechens and others. This is not new.
Yeah, this is their history.
This is their history. I said, don't reach the wrong conclusions and don't assume that these people aren't going to fight for their country. Well, they're the ones who invaded. But from the standpoint of Putin, once he gets into Ukraine, what he thought was a problem is infinitely greater. Once they get into eastern Ukraine, not only do they find this monstrous Ukrainian army for which he was unprepared, he also finds the biolab.
But is the intelligence on both sides failing at the time?
Yeah, I think so. I think both sides misinterpreted and misread things. No question about it.
But how is that possible? Because there has always been a good relation between the Russian and the Ukrainians. He must have had spies or something like that.
There's two things going on here. Yes, the Ukrainians and the Russians have cooperated and gotten along from time to time. They also haven't. And as we built this army up, we began essentially stoking the fires of the Second World War. Remember, not an estimated 9 million Ukrainian lives, probably 2 more million Russians as well that never are mentioned, but 9 million Ukrainians were systematically murdered between 1929 and 1933. The man who did it was in the NKVD. His name was Yagoda, and he and his NKVD officers went in there after they'd emptied prisons inside Russia and brought convicts with them because the convicts could be relied upon to rape and murder and steal whatever they found, which is what they wanted to do. They were there to destroy what they said was the Ukrainian, what we would say is middle class, but in reality, these people took the opportunity to effectively destroy Ukraine.
Are you referring to the Holodomor?
Yes, yeah. And this also
the farmers.
Yeah, but there's a cultural...
This is the wound in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, terrible. And this is one of the reasons why there were so many Ukrainians, and then later on many Russians as well, who went over to the Germans. This is something we don't talk about. But they began stoking these old fires. And there were always people in Western Ukraine who were enamored of National Socialism. And these symbols started showing up. And of course, this was done to aggravate the Russians on the one hand, but also to create the illusion that this was a new, superior army on the model of the German force.
You're referring to the Azov regiment, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of them.
And these things were funded by, at the time, Kolomoisky, who was Jewish. And remember, we had this man, Zelensky, who was Jewish. So you have the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, these symbols of hate and murder.
Even Nazism.
Yeah.
On the one hand.
Yeah, and all these Jews who are in prominent roles inside Ukraine and inside the government. It's bizarre. It makes no sense. But when you look at what they're interested in, the people who are running the country were interested in anything that would mobilize Ukrainians against Russians. And just as we in the United States are easily taken in by these unsophisticated depictions of the Soviet enemy 30 or 40 years ago and transposing that old picture of the enemy onto Russia, we're easily beguiled by that in the United States because we've been listening to bad people speak with Russian accents on television for decades. You had something similar happen in Ukraine.
Yeah, but let's get back to the army itself. But my question is, how come that the intelligence on both sides was failing?
I think there are two things that have to be taken into account because I've seen it happen here. It may be that President Putin received different kinds of intelligence assessments, and he picked and chose what he thought was appropriate. I have to take that into consideration.
Kind of wishful thinking.
I think President Putin is probably the single most adult and clear-thinking man in Europe and the world today.
And very prudent in a way.
Yeah. And very prudent. But on this occasion, I think he grossly misjudged the West, and I think he misjudged what was going on. It was even worse than he thought. Because remember, in his mind, he was expecting any day that these Pershing II missiles from the 1980s that were banned under the INF, that we now call them Standard missiles, but they're very, very powerful and very quick, that those would show up in eastern Ukraine. And that would place them within minutes of striking the Russian nuclear deterrent and destroy their early warning systems and so forth. That's what he was worried about. But when he gets in there, he finds out this Ukrainian army is actually exceptionally good. It's not perfect, but it's damn good. And they have to make a decision after about several months, what are we going to do? And remember, they tried in Istanbul. And they thought they had an agreement because the keystone in the agreement was neutrality for Ukraine. And at that point, he was ready to back out of Ukraine. And that brings up something else that's interesting. When the Russian forces first entered eastern Ukraine, they encountered lots of Russians. Obviously, the people there were Russian. And they said, well, thank God you've come. And then the people said, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're just here to, push the Ukrainians back and then get a deal, and then we'll leave. And the Russian people there said, if you're going to leave, then the Ukrainian secret police will come back and put bullets in all of our heads. So many of them said, the hell with you, we're not going to support you. If you're not here to liberate us and protect us,
you're not here to stay.
Go home, literally, these conversations were held. This was reported back to Putin. This is where Putin begins to realize he's dealing with a different animal from what he initially thought.
So, in fact, when we're talking about this war, then you could say Putin tried to give a signal to Zelensky, this is very serious, and to the West. So let's come to an agreement in which Ukraine remains neutral, doesn't become a threat to, and the position of Crimea is recognized.
And what he was looking for was something on the Austrian model. Because just as once Austria became neutral and the Russian forces left, there was still a Russian representative on the Austrian Defense Council for many years. And his job was to make sure the Austrians actually carried out, to the fullness of the law, what they'd agreed to. And that's what Putin wanted in Kiev. I want a Russian on the National Defense Council so that they can monitor that you're genuinely neutral.
But the interesting thing, of course, is how it's going to develop itself, because it became something different.
Well, that's right. The great lesson of margin of victory is that whatever you anticipated doesn't turn out to be the case. So if you think you're moving in for a brief period of time, or this is going to be a short war, you've probably made a serious mistake. So before you start anything, You need to stand back and look at all the possibilities.
Do you think at the time that Putin was aware that in fact he was fighting a war against the West?
No.
No?
No, that's the problem. He thought we were approachable. He thought the people, especially in Berlin, he was shocked when Scholz shows up and spews this nonsense. It was a case of cognitive dissonance, as we say in English. He couldn't reconcile what the man was saying with reality. He said, Scholz has joined this. Berlin is now in this camp that is violently anti-Russian. And we have no reason for the Germans to hate us. We've gotten along with the Germans. It's just sort of, what is going on? He couldn't believe it. He was surprised.
In fact, I wasn't surprised that this reaction was so fierce in the West. Maybe that it's
well, you live in the West.
I live in the West, of course, but especially in the Netherlands, we had this, of course, the issue with the MH17 at the time. You know, So there's a. And I always think that we dealt in the wrong way with that, but that's another question. That's a very sensitive issue in the Netherlands. But I felt you can say not the discontent, but maybe maybe a light form of hate towards Putin himself. Yeah, and they demonized him, and that started in 2014. I think this was the decisive moment in the Dutch relation to.
I think the problem there has always been his association with the KGB. You know, the assumption is that he's another NKVD thug, like Yagoda in Ukraine, and that was absolutely not the case. The other thing is, and I had time when I was in graduate school to meet with defectors. Many of whom were KGB agents or GRU people. And what you found from them was that they had traveled extensively outside of the Soviet Union. Yeah. They knew more about the West and had a very different view.
So they broadened their mind.
And that was the case with Putin. He had lived outside the country. He'd gotten to know Germany very well, liked the Germans, got along with the Germans. Yeah. And he began to see the West as a potential partner. Remember, he raised the issue of could Russia join NATO?
Yeah, was this a serious proposal?
I think it was very serious on his part. I think he was looking for an opportunity to integrate Russia into the West. But he's always had people around him saying, Vladimir, you don't understand. Yeah. They hate us. It doesn't matter what you do. And it's always interesting to me that people are so anxious to attack Putin when he is probably the best possible representative of Western interests in Moscow of anybody that exists. Everyone else was completely unsurprised by what we did.
Yeah, I think that's a very important remark, because the whole question is, when you start a war, you want to know about the outcome. And now, at the time, we're dealing with Putin, and you can say, well, Putin at least is a man, in a way prudent. He is not very aggressive towards the West. So the question is, when, for example, when you want a regime change, who do you think will be the alternative?
It's absurd. They have no idea what they're talking about. But that's not new. We never understood Vietnam. Yeah. We intervened in a civil war. We murdered the only man, we assassinated the only man that could hold the country together. His name was Diem. We created catastrophe. In Afghanistan, after we'd gone in, the one man that everyone was willing to live with in Afghanistan was the king, because he ran what we would call a confederation, where these were regional interests and so forth. What did we do? We removed him and put in a CIA agent named Karzai. And of course, then the corruption became unstoppable. We go into Iraq, and what do? We don't understand what we are doing. America blunders in like an elephant and crushes everything under its feet, and then says, aren't you happy I'm here? Aren't you grateful that I've come? I'm the big elephant that's going to deliver everything you want. Yeah. Well, I think what was happening for Putin is that he starts this thing and he suddenly realizes the elephant is the enemy, not the friend. And then by June, his generals sit down with him and they said, look, if you're serious about this, we're going to have to change everything. Yeah. we're going to have to be prepared to fight for years. This is a large war of decision. And that's when he realizes this is an existential threat to Russia. This is not something we are prepared under any circumstances to lose. Now, he never thought that was possible anyway, because very prudently he said, strategically, you want to fight me on my doorstep? You're pretty stupid. And he was right. But he grossly miscalculated initially. He thought he was dealing with a different set of leaders from what it was actually there. And then he decides to change everything. By the time you get to the fall, he appoints new leadership, and the Russian Air Force general who took over command effectively in the East builds this defensive thing and says, look, we can't hold everything because we don't have enough forces. You're going to have to withdraw over here from Kharkov. The Ukrainians said, oh, look,
the Zaluzhny, the defense line he built in Ukraine.
But then what's his name? I'm talking about the Russians, what the Russians built once they had established themselves in eastern Ukraine and the Russian-speaking areas.
Okay. Yeah.
To the north, they were very close to Kharkov, but it was very lightly defended. They only had 2,000 men up there. And the Ukrainians were told by us, because we began providing them with satellite intelligence.
What's this line called?
Well, it's just south of Kharkov. And it was just a plain right up to the river on the border with Russia. And we said, go ahead and attack that. And the commander said to President Putin, let him have it. It doesn't matter right now. We need to consolidate our position. Then we need to become impregnable. And when we've consolidated our position, our defenses are impregnable, then we launch offensives and we move out of them. Effectively, a repetition of Kursk from the Russian standpoint. And the Ukrainians were then invited to do what? Attack.
Yeah.
And we were stupid enough to tell them to attack. And what the Russians have proven and demonstrated, something they understood since the 70s, was the criticality of linking all of the overhead, space-based and terrestrial surveillance, unmanned and manned, drones, satellites, everything, with all of the standoff attack systems, rocket artillery, conventional artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, everything.
Let's get into that.
And when that was linked, then we didn't seem to appreciate the lethality of that system. I call it in my book, Margin of Victory, and previously in my previous book in 2003, Transformation Under Fire, I call it the ISR strike complex. And I said we have to integrate ground forces, maneuver, and logistics within this larger ISR strike complex. We have to go all the way back to Ogarkov in the night.
Yeah, that's the ISR is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance.
And he talked about the recon strike platform in space that will allow them to target and destroy anything on the planet. Of course, they didn't have the technology. And so this was conceptual, but he was right. And that's what you see emerge in eastern Ukraine.